Millard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome.
Thank you.
Before I ask my questions, just a comment based upon some other comments that I heard previous speakers make. A number of 102, 26, and 1. Yes, that's what it does take to make a budget, to pass legislation, to get it signed into law. So we did. We did it on time. We did it twice within the constraints of dollars. Actually, a third time. The first two times, the governor vetoed the budget in its entirety. The third time, he chose to do a line item veto. Now, when I look at those numbers and I look at what the original ask was by the governor, you understand that the word for additional investing in whatever program is a code word for taxes, for tax increases. And whenever the governor sets a ceiling on spending, that ceiling becomes the floor the next year round. And the key to this whole process is to sustain that spending level. And we proved with 3 times presenting balanced against revenue coming in that we can cover the programs with the dollars that are available to sustain continuation of those programs. So I look at the 102, 26, 1 number, and I say 102, we did it, 26, we did it, and 1, that's the bully in the schoolyard. That's the individual that has all of the power of both chambers to say yes or no. So that's my soapbox for today. Now my questions. Mr. Secretary, there seems to be a lot of confusion regarding 2 specific funds that impact your agency. Can you explain the difference between the State Racing Fund and the Racehorse Development Fund?
Yeah, Representative, thank you. Good question, and it's one that if you followed this discussion about horse racing, and you were involved in some of those discussions and the Act 71 expansion, so you have 2 very distinct pieces. The Racehorse Development Fund is a product of Act 71, so that was in 2004, and that was the gaming expansion, as we referred to it, brought slot machines to the racetracks and the racinos. And a portion of the dollars, of course, wagered then go into the Racehorse Development Fund. The State Racing Fund is the previous fund created by Act of 1982 when parimutuel racing in Pennsylvania was established. And the dollars that go into that particular fund come from parimutuel, tax on parimutuel wagers. That was the problem we were trying to fix and certainly confront it by and have since fixed through Act 7. But what we had was a situation where the parimutuel tax was insufficient to cover the cost of operations of the commissions in the operations of our tracks, and caused us, of course, last summer, fall, to run into this problem, potentially shutting down racing. But two distinct pieces. So solution now found in Act 7 by transferring some of those costs off of the Race Development Fund to the Horse Race Development Fund.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, the next question is somewhat related to that. What's the financial status of the Racing Fund, and what exactly does it support?
Yeah, so Mike, if you want to give the specifics, but because of Act 7 recently signed by the governor, you have operations of the commission proper on that fund. And then the testing that had previously been part of the fund is now transferred to the Racehorse Development Fund. Mike?
Thank you, Secretary. Representative, as you'll recall, as the Secretary mentioned, back in late summer, early fall, when we encountered the very real prospect that the State Racing Fund was going to run into a deficit that would have undermined our ability to finance the oversight of racing in Pennsylvania, maintaining its integrity. Through the negotiations, we were able to find compromise, which is now reflected in Act 7. Part of that, as the Secretary said, does shift costs, particularly for drug testing, off of the State Racing Fund onto the industry to be paid for by the Racehorse Development Fund. But because we still do not have a fiscal code with the transfer from the Racehorse Development Fund to compensate for that continued decline in pari-mutuel tax revenues, the Racing Fund is essentially still broke. There are two components to the State Racing Fund. There's a restricted portion and there's a non-restricted portion. The non-restricted portion is typically that which finances the work of the commission. The restricted portions are traditionally for breeding activities. In the course of the negotiations, we made clear with all the stakeholders that the only way, absent that Racehorse Development Fund transfer through the fiscal code, the only way we could continue to finance the oversight of racing would be to essentially borrow from those restricted funds, which is what we have been doing to date.
You've just answered my next 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
Now, the final thing that I'd like to address with you is the Pennsylvania fairs.
Yes.
We have 109 fairs at last count here in Pennsylvania. Over a dozen agricultural-related entities to that. We know that 4-H, FFA is deeply involved in our fairs on their way to the farm show. There's over 5 dozen 4-H and FFA organizations, nearly 2 dozen other agricultural organizations related to them. And of course, not to mention, understating the fact that those 109 fairs throughout the Commonwealth are all economic engines in themselves. And what they do in the community, they involve a lot of other groups, a lot of nonprofit groups, the Lions, the Rotary, and the list goes on. And I think it's important to highlight the economic drivers that they are, because even these nonprofits that are incorporated or operate on the grounds of the fairs, those dollars stay local. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for everybody to understand, that you're not sending dollars to Washington, D.C. or Harrisburg and then competing for those dollars. Typically, every dollar they collect stays there. Now, the fairs have typically been funded $4 million out of the Horse Race Development Fund. So I guess my question to you is that the governor's proposed budget for payments to the fairs is level at $4 million from the Racehorse Development Fund. How will these funds be allocated?
Yeah, so the $4 million would be, in the categories that you know. I mean, the operating funds for the reimbursement for the class of fair. You have statewide youth organizations or farm organizations covered out of that. You have individual FFA and 4-H membership payments, and since we've got a number of 4-H members here, that payment to Penn State and 4-H is $240,000, just as an example. That would leave you with approximately $800,000 that could be allocated for capital projects.
And those are dollar-for-dollar match?
Yes, they are.
Up
Yes.
to?
Up to $50,000.
$50,000.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the clarification of everything that I've asked. And listen, I'm on that bandwagon. We have to support the good kids in our community, the 4-H kids, 24/7. They're taking care of animals and doing all kinds of great things. And I know that the future of this Commonwealth, if it's left up to those individuals, we're in real good hands.
Agree, and thank you for your support of fairs, your advocacy always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.